Hey everyone, this is just going to be a short, unscripted video on something rather curious that I stumbled across on the internet. It was an interview with author George R.R. Martin, and he talked about a number of things, but there was something he said about Lord of the Rings that I thought was rather curious. I'll let the man speak for himself.
Game of Thrones is absolutely full of sex, and I'd like to thank you for that because I enjoy that very much.
Oh, good. Well, you're welcome.
Why?
Well, life is very full of sex, or should be. I'm as much as I admire Tolkien, and I do. He was a giant of fantasy and a giant of literature, and I think he wrote a great book that will be read for many years. But you do have to wonder where all those hobbits came from, since you can't imagine hobbits having sex, can you? Well, sex is an important part of who we are. It drives us, it motivates us, it makes us do sometimes very noble things, it makes us do sometimes incredibly stupid things. Leave it out and you've got an incomplete world.
Now, when I heard him say this, I was just kind of baffled. I thought to myself, Mr. Martin, that's a weird thing to say, isn't it? When he says that you can't imagine the hobbits having sex, can you? Well, I can. I'd prefer not to, but I can. I can fully accept that. The hobbits are randy little buggers when they're not on the page. And, of course, people on Tumblr, they kind of dragged him for it. They said things like, "This man is apparently under the impression that we need sex scenes to understand that sex exists in any given story, and honestly, that explains so much about his writing." Well, snarky remarks aside, what I think Mr. Martin is trying to get at here is that no one in Lord of the Rings is ever motivated by lust. No one ever gets horny. They can be motivated by anything from a lust for power, to greed, to despair, but the maidens of Edoras aren't drooling over Aragorn's chiseled abs. You don't have Gimli looking at Galadriel and thinking, "Man, she's got a fantastic ass. God, I love that elf cake." No one thinks like that. No one has those kinds of thoughts, and apparently, Mr. Martin thinks that this is an incomplete world because of it. At least, I hope that's what he's saying, and I'm not just dreadfully misinterpreting his intentions. But that does beg the question of why? Why is it that no one in Lord of the Rings is ever horny? Well, it's not because of when the book was written. I mean, Conan the Barbarian debuted in 1932, and you better believe that Conan got laid. It's not because medieval literature didn't have horny people in it. No, go read The Miller's Tale if you don't believe me. No, the most obvious answer to Mr. Martin's question is that Lord of the Rings began with The Hobbit, and The Hobbit was a children's book, so obviously you're not going to have sexual situations in that kind of story. Secondly, consider what sort of person Tolkien was. He was this English, upper-class, Oxford-educated philologist who was also a devout Catholic on top of that. He's probably going to be rather disinclined to write something raunchy or ribald or anything like that. Expecting him to write something like that is a bit like expecting a romantasy author like Sarah J. Maas to write something that's actually good. And also, consider the tone of The Lord of the Rings. Tone is important because it sets expectations for what can and cannot happen in a story. If the tone of your book is a whimsical, light-hearted comedy, then you're probably not going to have any scenes of graphic violence or brutality. Likewise, if your story is dark and serious, it's probably not going to have silly comedic scenes in it. That's just basic common sense, really. And what is the tone of Lord of the Rings? It's elevated. It's mythopoetic. Tolkien was deliberately drawing influences from the sagas of Northern Europe. So if you've ever read something like the Saga of the Volsungs, or the Kalevala, or Beowulf, you can recognize that right away. It's even in the language he uses. Tolkien uses very archaic language, like Saruman is once described as dwemer crafty, a phrase that, unless you're a huge English nerd, you probably have no idea what that actually meant. Now, If Lord of the Rings were a gritty, low fantasy about morally ambiguous characters trying to survive in a violent and corrupt world, then yes, the novel being sexless would probably come across as a little weird, but that's not what it is. It's high fantasy. It deals with epic, sweeping stories, the grand arc of history, not, well, who's shagging who. There are romantic relationships in the story, but they're all pushed very, very far into the background. You know, George R.R. Martin famously stated in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, what was Aragorn's tax policy? And a lot of people took this out of context to mean that he was just nitpicking, but what he was really saying is, Lord of the Rings wasn't interested in the gritty details of medieval rulership, but my story is. That's why I write lengthy scenes of characters suffering from dysentery. And when Mr. Martin says that, sex drives people in real life and that leaving it out of Lord of the Rings somehow makes it an incomplete world, I just have to wonder, what makes you think that it's not happening in the story? It's just not happening to the characters we're reading about. I mean, I have an imagination. I can imagine things happening off screen that the author is choosing not to focus on. Because, obviously those hobbits, those little hobbit babies have to come from somewhere, right? I can fully accept that there are horn dogs in Middle-earth who can't get enough of that elf cake. We're just not hearing about it because that's not what the author is interested in. And I think it should be a basic tenet of criticism, of media criticism, that you don't criticize something for not doing what the author never intended it to do. And Lord of the Rings was never supposed to be a gritty, realistic depiction of either Middle-earth or the real Middle Ages. I'm always annoyed when some nerd reads Lord of the Rings and then comes back saying something like, well, actually, Aragorn wouldn't be a good king because real medieval kings were backstabbing psychopaths who climbed to power on a pile of dead bodies. And on the subject of Mr. Martin's writing, well, I'm not a prude or a zoomer. I'm not going to freak out over seeing a sex scene in a fantasy book because I'm an adult and I can handle that sort of thing. At the same time, however, I don't want to read about incest or rape or underage brides or anything like that. And when I point that out, when I express that opinion on fantasy, invariably what happened is that a bunch of nerds would suddenly pull PhDs in medieval studies out of their asses and go, well, actually, that's just what happened in real life. And I heard the same thing with the Witcher games. You point out that you don't like all the misogynistic violence in this setting? Well, guess what? Someone's going to say something like, well, don't you read history? That's what things were really like back then. Look, the point I'm trying to make with all this ranting and raving is that when a fantasy author creates a setting, they are effectively the god of that setting. And that fictional world will always be incomplete in some way because every author has to choose what to leave in and what to leave out. And invariably, that decision will be based on everything from the target audience of the book, the tone the author wants to strike, to whatever they're comfortable or not comfortable with writing. So I will just say that, Mr. Martin, if you're watching this video, which you most certainly are not, I'm sure you're very busy writing the next novel in your Song of Ice and Fire series, which is going to come out any day now, that this is probably not a Lord of the Rings problem. This is probably more of a you problem. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about that. See you later, everyone.